Look behind nearly every guitar god who ever owned a stage, and you'll find the same name burning on the headstock: Gibson. It roared behind Slash. It sang the blues for B.B. King. It built the sound of rock and roll itself, one Les Paul at a time. This was no ordinary company. This was a legend, more than a century old, woven into the DNA of modern music. And then, in the spring of 2018, that legend collapsed into bankruptcy, buried under more than $500 million of debt. But here's the part that'll stop you cold. It wasn't guitars that nearly killed Gibson. The company that gave the world its greatest instruments was brought to its knees by something else entirely: a reckless obsession that had almost nothing to do with the six strings that made it famous. This is the story of how an empire of sound almost destroyed itself, and the one decision that nearly ended it all. And all of that glory, the screaming solos, the smoke-filled stages, the name every kid scratched into a school desk, none of it started in a boardroom or a factory. It started as one man's part-time hobby, in a tiny one-room workshop carved out by hand. The company that would one day arm the loudest bands on the planet began with a single craftsman bent over a workbench, chasing a sound that lived only in his head. No investors, no grand vision of stadiums, just sawdust, patience, and an obsession with getting the wood exactly right. And here lies the cruel irony at the heart of this whole story. The thing that almost killed Gibson 120 years later wasn't bad luck or bad timing. It was the moment the company forgot that humble truth, that it was, at its core, a maker of fine instruments, and nothing more. To understand how a legend nearly threw itself away, we have to go back to the beginning, back to a man named Orville. He looked at the finest instruments of his day and called them ugly, clumsy, badly built. And then he set out to prove it. Orville Gibson is born in 1856 and eventually makes his way to the small town of Kalamazoo, Michigan. He isn't a businessman, he isn't an engineer. He's a craftsman with a stubborn idea and an almost obsessive eye for detail. At the time, mandolins were built with rounded, fragile, bowl-like backs, and Orville thought they were a disaster. So he did something nobody had dared. He carved the tops and backs of his instruments with a gentle arch, the same way violins had been built for centuries. The result was stronger, louder, and richer in tone. It was a quiet act of rebellion against the way things had always been done. And it was that single, stubborn instinct to ignore tradition and chase a better sound that would lay the foundation for everything Gibson became. For all his brilliance with wood and tone, Orville Gibson would die without ever seeing the empire his name would build. The story starts small. In 1894, he's hand-building guitars and mandolins out of a cramped one-room shop in Kalamazoo. Demand for his strange, beautiful instruments grows fast, faster than one man with a chisel can ever hope to keep up with. So in 1902, a group of investors steps in and forms a company around his name, while Orville himself simply lends that name in exchange for a royalty. Think about that. The man becomes a brand, but never truly a boss. He drifts to the edges of his own creation, his health failing, the company growing without him. And in 1918, Orville Gibson dies, long before the world would ever understand just how massive his little workshop idea would become. But the name lived on, and the name was just getting started. They didn't sell guitars in stores. They turned the music teachers themselves into a secret army of salesmen. This was Gibson's first masterstroke, and almost nobody talks about it. In the early days, getting an instrument into a stranger's hands was hard, so Gibson found a clever way around it. The company began courting music teachers across the country, handing them discounts and catalogs, then letting them sell instruments directly to their own students. It was genius. Every teacher became a trusted storefront. Every lesson became a sales pitch. A kid who admired their instructor now had the easiest path in the world to owning a Gibson. While rivals waited for customers to wander in off the street, Gibson built a web of loyal sellers reaching into towns and parlors no shop could touch. That quiet, clever network gave the brand a foothold that its competitors simply couldn't match. But none of those clever sales tricks would have meant a thing if the instruments themselves weren't extraordinary. And that's the heartbeat of this entire story, the one principle that defined Gibson for over a century. The instrument comes first, quality above everything. While other makers chased shortcuts and cheaper production, Gibson obsessed over the craft, treating every guitar like it mattered, like it carried the company's soul. And that obsession turned a single Michigan town into something legendary. For decades, the name Gibson made Kalamazoo the beating heart of the stringed instrument world. At one point, an astonishing 85% of every fretted instrument built in America came from that one place. 85%. Sit with that number. This wasn't just a company anymore. It was the standard the whole industry measured itself against. Remember that principle. The instrument always comes first. Because the day Gibson forgot it, everything started to fall apart. In 1952, Gibson took a solid plank of wood, bolted on 6 strings, and accidentally invented the future of music. They called it the Les Paul, the company's first solid-body electric guitar. At first, it was just an experiment, but what came next changed everything. Over the following years, Gibson entered a golden age, a run of designs so perfect they've arguably never been topped. They created the humbucker, a pickup that killed the irritating hum and delivered a thick, warm, muscular tone. They built the ES-335 and the legendary Les Paul Standard, guitars that would end up in the hands of nearly every icon who ever mattered. These weren't just instruments. They became the literal building blocks of rock and roll, of blues, of everything loud that came after. When you picture a screaming guitar solo in your head, odds are you're hearing a Gibson. The company wasn't just keeping pace with music anymore. It was shaping the sound of entire generations. By the mid-1960s, Gibson sat at the very top of the mountain, cranking out more than 100,000 guitars every single year. The sound was everywhere. The name was untouchable. But this is where the story darkens. New corporate owners took the wheel, a company called Norlin, and slowly, the magic began to rot. Quality slipped. The obsession with craft faded. The guitars that once defined perfection started losing their soul, and by the mid-1980s, this once mighty legend was effectively broke. Then came the rescue. In 1986, a sharp, hungry businessman named Henry Juskowitz bought the dying company for just $5 million. And at first, he was the hero. He dragged Gibson back from the edge of the grave, restored its name, and rebuilt it into a powerhouse that would one day command nearly 40% of the entire premium guitar market. Remember his name, because the man who saved Gibson is the very same man who would almost destroy it. The man who rescued Gibson from death became the very person who nearly buried it for good. And it all began with one fatal case of ambition. Somewhere along the way, Henry Juskowitz stopped seeing Gibson as a guitar company. He wanted to build a music lifestyle empire, headphones, speakers, home electronics, the works. So he started spending. Using borrowed money, he went on a buying spree, snapping up consumer electronics brands like Onkyo, TEAC, and the audio business of Philips. The debt piled higher and higher, eventually swelling past $500 million. And as if that weren't enough, the company got hit from another direction entirely. Federal agents stormed Gibson's factories, seizing wood and guitars over questions about how imported materials had been declared. The headlines were brutal. The legend that built rock and roll was suddenly drowning, not in bad guitars, but in bad decisions. By the spring of 2018, the empire finally cracked. Gibson filed for bankruptcy. A company more than 120 years old, the soul of rock and roll, brought to its knees. But here's the twist that saves this story. The creditors who took control, led by an investment firm called KKR, pushed Henry Yuskowicz out, dumped the entire electronics disaster, and dragged the company back to one simple idea: just make guitars. And it worked. Gibson didn't just survive, it roared back to life, healthier than it had been in years. The lesson here is almost painfully simple. The moment you abandon the very thing that made you great, chasing something you were never meant to be, you risk losing everything. Stay true to your craft, and your craft will carry you home. So now I want to hear from you. What's the greatest Gibson guitar moment in music history? The one riff or solo that still gives you chills? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story gripped you, hit subscribe, because the next legend we resurrect might surprise you.